5 alien soldiers knocked on her porch seeking shelter from the frost. They thought they'd found an easy target, a retired woman living alone on a forgotten ranch. They didn't know she'd run out of fear 3 wars ago. What happens next proves that humanity's greatest warriors never truly retire. They just wait for the right provocation. The 5 figures emerged from the biting frost, their silhouettes sharp against the yellow porch light. Their dark uniforms were standard Imperial issue, though they'd draped them with civilian coats and scarves they didn't know how to wear properly. They moved with the disciplined quiet of soldiers who'd spent years crossing contested ground without making a sound. Their eyes, pale and alien, scanned doorframes and window lines, noting fields of fire and cover positions as naturally as breathing. They registered the old woman standing in the doorway as a soft target, a lone civilian in an isolated location. They told her their transport broke down a few miles back, their words rehearsed and unconvincing. The one who spoke kept his hands visible, but his teammates were already placing themselves to control the room if needed. Vance didn't react. She stood with the door half open, the warmth from inside spilling out around her like a lure. Her eyes didn't flick to their hidden weapon bulges, or the way their boots were laced for rapid movement. She simply nodded and invited them in from the cold. Inside, she moved to the stove and poured coffee into heavy clay mugs. She set out a plate of biscuits, her movements slow and deliberate. The soldiers accepted the offerings, their thanks stiff and formal. As they drank, she watched, their hands wrapped around the mugs not for warmth, but out of muscle memory, the way a soldier holds a ration cup in the field. They ate the biscuits in quick, efficient bites, not tasting, just refueling. Their eyes never stopped moving, cataloging the room's single exit, the wood stove's iron door, the shadows in the hallway. Vance leaned against the counter, her own mug cradled loosely. She remarked that she wasn't the Queen of England, just an old woman who didn't get many visitors. The joke was dry and it didn't land. It wasn't meant to. It was a piece of misdirection, a casual line to make them see harmless eccentricity instead of the threat assessment happening behind her calm expression. She noted which one checked his wrist for a timepiece that wasn't there, which one positioned himself to watch the door and the window simultaneously, which one's eyes lingered a second too long on the old service rifle leaning in the corner. Every clink of a mug on the table, every shift of weight on the wooden floor, every controlled breath was another data point. She was building their profile in her mind without writing a single thing down. Their leader finally set his empty cup down a little too carefully. He was beginning to suspect the hospitality was a tool. He saw that she was watching them, but he assumed she was just cautious, just scared. He thought her silence was the quiet of a woman alone, not the calculating stillness of a commander evaluating hostile forces in her territory. The frost outside seemed warm compared to the quiet in that kitchen. The soldiers felt the shift but misread it entirely. They thought the cold was coming from the night at the windows. They didn't understand it was radiating from the woman smiling faintly by the stove, her intelligence gathering complete, her tactical picture clear. Morning light revealed the ranch as something more than weathered buildings and rusted equipment. Vance moved through her chores with a veteran's economy of motion. Each step had purpose. Each action served 2 masters. She wasn't just feeding chickens. She was checking the tension on the nearly invisible tripwire buried in the dust near their coop. She wasn't just mending a section of fence. She was testing the conductivity of the top wire, ensuring it could deliver a non-lethal but disabling charge. The water troughs filled from a creaking hand pump, concealed crude but effective pressure plates and insulated wiring that ran back toward the main house. To the alien soldiers watching from the porch, it was the slow, methodical work of an old woman on a failing property. They saw age in isolation. They missed the traps being maintained right in front of them. They whispered among themselves in low tones, their alien consonants soft in the cold air. They assumed the years had stolen her strength, that retirement had dulled her edge. They saw a woman bent over a stubborn engine, not a commander assessing her defensive perimeter. One of the veterans smirked as she struggled with a heavy feed bag, missing how her placement of it blocked a key line of sight to the barn's secondary door. Vance paused, her hand resting on a support beam as if catching her breath. Her fingers trailed over the wood grain, feeling for the vibration of a distant vehicle, testing the wind's direction and speed. She was reading the landscape like a topographical map laid out for battle. noting every fold in the land that could conceal movement, every open space that became a killing zone. Her rifle still stood in the corner of the kitchen, visible through the open door. It was a calculated piece of staging. It said she was armed but not immediately threatening. It was a test of their discipline and a reminder of her capability, a display of trust that was really a warning. The young soldier, the one with the nervous eyes, kept glancing at it. His gaze would flick from the weapon to the way the morning sun glinted off a particular length of barbed wire, to the suspiciously clean path worn in the grass leading to a tool shed. He saw the patterns the others dismissed. The veteran saw scrap. He saw potential. While his comrades focused on the woman's slow pace, he noticed the strategic placement of the woodpile, stacked to form a chest-high barrier between the house and the main approach. He saw how the rusted farm implements leaning against the barn wall had handles worn smooth in specific grips, not from farm work, but from being held ready. His anxiety grew with each new detail. He was piecing together a picture the mission brief had never considered. The ranch was transforming before his eyes, its peaceful facade dissolving into a network of prepared positions and improvised weapons. What Imperial intelligence had labeled a retirement was in fact a long-term strategic positioning. Vance hadn't withdrawn from conflict. She had chosen her ground and spent years hardening it, turning a forgotten piece of land into a fortress designed to be underestimated. Every chore, every repair, every quiet day was another layer added to her defenses. They were standing in the center of a weapon they didn't know how to see, their arrogance blinding them to the fact that the battlefield was already occupied, and they were the guests. That afternoon, Vance sat with them in the barn's dim light, a box of old photographs open on a crate between them. The alien soldiers had steered the conversation, probing carefully for confirmation of the rumors, the stories about the human commander who disappeared after the carnage at Cygnus Gate. They sought a name, a face, a piece of intelligence to lock into place. Vance gave them stories instead of answers. Her finger tapped a faded image of a man on horseback. She said that was her father, working cattle up in the high passes. She didn't mention the horse was stolen from an Imperial outpost, or that her father died in the first orbital bombardment. She spoke of herself at 20, all sharp angles and quiet rage. Said she was meaner than she looked back then. She left out the part where she led a militia charge through a burning city. They watched her, their training making them note every hesitation, every omission. They sensed the gaps in her narrative, the spaces where the truth should be. Their certainty began to fray at the edges. One of them mentioned the flag, the one the Empire's propagandists showed being raised over the human dead at the gate. They called it a symbol of surrender. Vance picked up a skinning knife from the workbench and balanced it across her knees. She said they liked to wrap their dead in it, called it an unfinished promise. The way she said it made the cloth sound less like a shroud and more like a delayed fuse. Her tone was dry, almost casual, as she reframed their entire understanding of the conflict. She talked about suicide missions not as acts of desperation, but as matters of practical geometry, calculating angles of approach, rates of fire, acceptable losses. She called it making the math work. This wasn't the irrational human fanaticism their briefings described. This was cold, applied physics. This was a species that looked at a no-win scenario and started redesigning the victory conditions. The veterans shifted uncomfortably. Their doctrine had no counter for this. This was not about eliminating a single squad. It was about attacking the foundation of their military confidence. A dead soldier is a closed file. A living broken witness is an open wound. His story would spread through the ranks faster than any official casualty report. It would move through mess halls and barracks as a whisper, then a rumor, then a confirmed nightmare. The facts would be undeniable. The Empire's intelligence was wrong. Their tactical superiority was a myth. Their understanding of human capability was a catastrophic failure. The story of 5 soldiers falling to one woman would do more damage than the loss of 500 in a conventional battle. It would unravel the certainty that held their entire war effort together. His trauma was no longer a personal affliction. It was a weaponized asset. The shaking in his hands, the tremor in his voice, the nightmares he would carry for the rest of his life. These were not side effects. They were the intended payload. His broken composure would sell the story far more effectively than a calm, professional debriefing ever could. He would be living proof of their inferiority. His command would see not just a defeated soldier but a defeated ideology. They would look at him and see the face of their own arrogance and the terrible price it extracted. His survival was the final, calculated move in her defense. He lived because a broken messenger inflicts a deeper, more lasting wound than a dead one. His return trip would be the second phase of the engagement. The conflict did not end on her property. It was merely transmitted. His shaking hands would carry the seeds of doubt and defeat back to the heart of the Empire. He would deliver a psychological virus that would spread through their command structure, eroding morale and crippling operational confidence long after the dust settled on her quiet ranch. The shooting was over. The war of perception was just beginning, and he was its sole unwilling soldier. Vance descended into the root cellar, her boots scraping on worn stone steps. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and old wood. In the corner, under a heavy canvas tarp, sat her transmitter. It wasn't a military model. It was a civilian rig, decades old, its casing scratched and its dials yellowed with age. Her hands, rough with a lifetime of work, moved over it with a familiarity that defied time. They remembered the craft. The aliens believed she was cut off, a lone voice in the wilderness with no way to call for help. They were wrong. Her isolation was her broadcast strength. Her fingers twisted knobs, her ear close to the speaker as she tuned the frequency. The signal didn't use encrypted military bands. It piggybacked on civilian wavelengths, a stream of data disguised as a routine agricultural weather report. To any Imperial monitor scanning the area, it would read as nothing more than automated updates on barometric pressure and precipitation forecasts for local farms. The deception was perfect. It hid in the noise of everyday life, a weapon concealed in mundanity. The message itself was a compressed data burst. It contained no words, no plea for assistance. It was a string of confirmation codes, authentication sequences that hadn't been used since the final hours of Cygnus Gate. They were her old command codes, the ones she'd used to issue the invitation. They were a digital fingerprint, a return address that hadn't been active for a generation. High above the planet in the cold silence of orbit, the signal was caught. It wasn't Imperial ships that intercepted it. Human listening posts, hidden in the debris fields of dead moons and camouflaged as asteroid fragments, locked onto the transmission. Their systems, dormant for years, recognized the codes instantly. They didn't receive a distress call. They downloaded a tactical update package. The brief transmission contained a complete situational report. Confirmed enemy presence, confirmed hostile intent, confirmation of the Empire's catastrophic intelligence failure. The Empire's arrogance, its belief that it had cowed humanity into submission, was now a verified data point. That confirmation was the trigger. It was the condition she had set decades prior. The transmission lasted less than 5 seconds. Then the set went dark, the speaker emitting only a soft, hollow static. In that brief window, it accomplished its purpose. It didn't request help. It activated a protocol. Across the solar system, networks that had been sleeping for decades woke up. Lights flickered on in derelict command centers. Power readings spiked on silent ships drifting in strategic holding patterns. The response wasn't a panicked scramble of rescue craft. It was the cold, deliberate fulfillment of standing strategic orders written a lifetime ago. It was the execution of a plan long since deemed obsolete by everyone but its architect. Her remote ranch, written off by the Empire as the lonely outpost of a forgotten soldier, became the catalyst. It was the spark that jumped the gap, waking a defensive network everyone believed was dead and buried. The 5 soldiers who knocked on her door seeking shelter had achieved the exact opposite of their mission. They hadn't eliminated a threat from the past. They had proven that threat was more present and more prepared than their high command could possibly imagine. Their attempt to prevent a resurgence had accidentally provided the proof of concept that started it. They came to end a war. They gave the signal to begin it. Alien High Command expected limited resistance. Their intelligence report spoke of a broken human defense network, scattered remnants unable to mount a coordinated response. They believed the elimination of one retired officer on a backwater world was a surgical operation, a minor cleanup action. They looked at their sensor displays and saw empty space. They were wrong. Human ships didn't decloak. They emerged. They slid from behind the dark sides of moons, their hulls still cold from the long drift. They powered up from asteroid fields, shaking off layers of dust and camouflage netting. They rose from the silent shadows of derelict orbital stations, systems humming to life after decades of standby. Their positioning was precise, interlocking fields of fire established before the first Imperial alarm sounded. The Imperial fleet's reaction was slow, confused. Their tactical computers scrambled to reassess the threat. Their weapon systems hesitated, their targeting protocols built to engage known human ship classes and formations. These vessels were different. They were older models, yes, but heavily modified. Their weapon mounts were non-standard, their engine signatures unfamiliar. They moved with an eerie coordination, not the rigid formation of a drilled fleet, but the fluid, adaptive movement of a single organism. A wing of Imperial fighters launched, their plasma cannons blazing. The human ships didn't return fire directly. They used the asteroids. They maneuvered the Imperial shots into rich mineral deposits, causing massive, contained explosions that shattered the fighter screen with their own redirected energy. Their technology wasn't more advanced. It was smarter. It was innovation applied with decades of quiet preparation. The battle in the void mirrored the one on the ranch with chilling symmetry. It was calculated, prepared, and utterly decisive. It was not a brawl. It was a demonstration. Vance's 5-second signal hadn't been a call for help. It was a key turning in a lock. It unleashed a set of predetermined response protocols, war plans written and shelved after Cygnus Gate. Every human captain on every waking ship answered the same invitation she had offered all those years before. They saw the confirmation code flash across their screens, the one they thought they'd never see again, and they chose to stand. They didn't wait for orders from a central command that no longer existed. They acted on standing orders from a general they still followed. The young soldier had been trembling since they sat down, a fine shake in his hands he couldn't control. But as Vance spoke, the tremor changed. The fear of the unknown began to crystallize into the specific, chilling fear of recognition. He was putting it together, the strategic mind assessing them since they arrived. The ranch positioned like a forward operating base, the way she held the knife not like a tool, but like a familiar instrument. The pieces of the legend they'd been sent to eliminate were clicking into place right in front of him, wearing the face of a retired woman telling stories in a dusty barn. The air in the barn grew thick. The walls seemed to press inward, leaning closer to catch her low, even words. The veterans finally saw it too. The woman on the crate, the knife on her knees, the calm, omniscient gaze. It matched the psychological profile their high command had circulated after Cygnus Gate. The target they thought was a ghost was serving them coffee and dissecting their mission with parables. Their objective had just inverted itself. This was no longer a simple assassination of a forgotten threat. This was a survival exercise. They were no longer hunters in neutral territory. They were prey in the lion's den, and the lion was just beginning to stretch. The aliens expected a briefing on command structures. They thought they'd hear about conscripted armies and forced service, the kind of top-down control their own empire relied on. They were braced for a story of human obedience, of soldiers following a general's desperate order into a massacre. Vance gave them something else entirely. She spoke with the flat precision of an after-action report, her voice stripped of pride or nostalgia. She told them humanity doesn't answer orders, it answers invitations. Her signal from Cygnus Gate wasn't a command. It wasn't a demand. It was a single burst transmission, a data packet containing the enemy's positions, their supply lines, their projected assault vectors. It was a complete tactical picture of their own impending victory, and it was sent to every civilian frequency still operating on the planet. She didn't tell anyone what to do with it. She just gave them the math. She made the choice. Factory workers looked at the schematics of Imperial walkers and knew where to plant the shaped charges. Farmers studied the approach lanes and knew which ridge offered the best sight lines for a hunting rifle. Dock workers saw the supply manifests and knew which crates to lose in the river. They weren't soldiers. They made a different choice. They stood. Every single one who received the signal looked at the information and made the same calculation. The tide didn't turn because of a brilliant general. It turned because an entire species was invited to fight and chose to accept. This truth landed in the quiet barn with more force than any plasma rifle. The alien soldiers stared at her, their imperial conditioning struggling to process the concept. Their entire doctrine was built on hierarchy and enforced compliance. The idea of voluntary coordinated defiance on a planetary scale wasn't just a tactic. It was a psychological weapon they had no defense against. The phrase "not an order, an invitation" became a quiet, cruel joke on the universe. It was a statement of principle their intelligence analysts had dismissed as cultural noise. They had graphs and charts predicting human behavior, based on resource scarcity and threat response. They had no column for stubborn, illogical defiance. They had no metric for a spirit that fights because it chooses to, not because it is told to. Their reports were meticulous and completely, catastrophically wrong. They failed to account for the single most important variable: free will applied with violent intent. The veterans in that barn finally understood their error. They weren't hunting a lone, dangerous relic of a broken army. They were facing the living embodiment of that principle. The woman serving them coffee was the one who issued the invitation. She was the proof that the spirit they thought they'd crushed at Cygnus Gate was not only alive, it was waiting for them. Their mission was a joke, sending 5 elite soldiers to eliminate a concept. Their arrogance wasn't just a personal failing. It was a systemic blind spot that ran through their entire command structure. A flaw so deep it doomed their war effort before the first shot was ever fired. They came to kill a general. They found a doctrine, and it was looking right back at them. Vance's hospitality revealed itself as a form of layered psychological warfare, conducted with the patience of a long-range sniper. The simple act of serving coffee became a complex field test of discipline and cultural penetration. Her offer to keep the frost off their bones carried the subtle weight of a threat, a reminder of their exposure and her control over the elements that could claim them. She watched not their faces for lies, but their hands, how they held the thick clay mugs, palms wrapped around for stability like a weapon grip, fingers positioned for quick release. She noted the way they sipped, not tasting the bitter brew but consuming it like field rations in efficient swallows between scans of the room. Their training betrayed them. They tried to maintain the civilian pretense of weary travelers, but their bodies remembered a different protocol. They avoided touching the stove even though it radiated warmth, keeping a tactical distance from the potential weapon. They never let their backs face the door for more than a few seconds. Their own elite conditioning worked against them, creating a performance so stiff and unnatural it fed her more intelligence than any confession. Every forced smile, every awkward attempt at small talk was another data stream for her to analyze. The laugh lines around her eyes did not crinkle with humor. They framed a gaze that was taking measurements, calculating reaction times, assessing psychological breaking points. The genuine warmth from the iron stove beat against their legs, a physical comfort that stood in stark contrast to the cold, analytical silence in her watchful eyes. They misinterpreted her patience. They saw the slow pour of more coffee, the quiet observation, as the placid weakness of an old woman who had accepted their presence. They thought her calm was submission. Their mistake became clear in a single fluid movement. The alien leader shifted his weight, a subtle signal to his team that the intelligence gathering was over, and the real mission was beginning. His hand started to drift toward the concealed weapon at his hip. He never completed the motion. Vance closed the distance between them without seeming to hurry. One moment she was at the counter, the next she was beside him, her hand resting lightly on his wrist. There was no visible aggression, no shouted warning, just precise, undeniable pressure on a nerve cluster that made his fingers go numb. The violence was so controlled, so clinical, it was more shocking than a gunshot. The message was delivered without a word. Their host was not just observant. She was faster, smarter, and owned the space around them completely. Her warning about mistaking kindness for weakness hung in the air, unspoken but understood. It was the core of her strategy, a lesson they were learning too late. The bitterness of the coffee they had swallowed now tasted like the precursor of a far more profound defeat. They had consumed her hospitality, and in doing so they had accepted her terms. The warmth of the kitchen felt like a trap closing. The refreshment was a precondition. The comfort was a setup. They were not guests being cared for. They were assets being managed, and her assessment was nearly complete. The aftertaste of the brew was the flavor of their own miscalculation, a dry and bitter truth they would have to swallow on her timeline. The ritual was over. The evaluation was final. The young soldier's fear became the hairline fracture in their unit's operational certainty. His comrades saw it as a weakness, a flaw in his training to be corrected or ignored. Vance saw it as intelligence. It was data, His hands shook not from the cold but from a deep instinctual recognition that their mission parameters were built on a lie. He looked out of place among the veterans, a fresh recruit surrounded by soldiers who had long since buried their capacity for fresh terror under layers of doctrine and routine. They had forgotten what it felt like to truly be afraid, to feel the cold certainty of a bad decision before the first shot was fired. He hadn't. That made him dangerous to them, useful to her. In the barn, his whispers were meant for his team leader's ear only. Quiet questions about contingency plans, about the woman's unsettling calm, about the too-perfect isolation of the ranch. Each question was a thread of doubt pulled from the fabric of their confidence. He was the only one looking at the environment not as a tactical problem to be solved, but as a predator's den they had willingly entered. Vance watched him specifically. She didn't stare. Her gaze would drift over the group, but it always returned to him, reading the slight tremors in his hands, the rapid blink rate, the way his breath hitched when the old house settled. These were not signs of cowardice. They were tactical communications, a bio-readout of a unit on the verge of critical failure. His growing realization that they had awakened something they could not put down was not an accident. It was the planned outcome. She had been cultivating that specific fear since they stepped onto her porch. The veterans dismissed his concerns. One clapped him on the shoulder too hard, a gesture meant to inspire confidence that only amplified his isolation. They told him to focus on the mission, to trust his training. They mistook his desire to live for a lack of will to kill. It was the opposite. His will to live was so strong it overrode his programming. He didn't want to die for a miscalculation. That desire created a fundamental flaw in their unit cohesion. They were a blade meant to strike as one. He was the tang that had come loose in the hilt. Vance calculated how to exploit it. She didn't need to break the unit. She just needed to identify the point of failure and apply pressure at the correct moment. Her strategy did not require the elimination of all 5 soldiers. It required a messenger. The mission was already a failure the moment they crossed her threshold. The strategic imperative shifted from defense to communication. The truth of what happened here needed to travel back up the chain of command. A dead squad was a mystery. A broken survivor was a weapon. His terror was more valuable than his death. Before the first shot was ever fired, his survival was predetermined. It was not an act of mercy. It was a logistical necessity. He would be the vessel. His memory would carry the images of his dead comrades, the chilling efficiency of the traps, the calm certainty of the woman who defeated them. He would deliver a psychological virus directly into the heart of their intelligence apparatus. His trembling hands would pass along the evaluation their own commanders had failed to make. They had underestimated humanity at a species level. His survival was the final move in a game they didn't know they were playing. A piece allowed to escape the board to spread panic across the entire enemy line. Dawn broke across the property, revealing it not as a homestead but as a symphony of calculated chaos waiting for a conductor. The alien stood on the porch, scanning the quiet landscape with trained eyes. They believed they were assessing a vulnerable target in the clear morning light, a soft asset in an undefended location. They were wrong. Every routine chore Vance performed was a deliberate activation of hidden systems. Her movements were slow, methodical, and utterly precise. She wasn't just maintaining a ranch. She was conducting an orchestra of destruction they couldn't hear tuning up. She walked to the dog run, a bucket of scraps in her hand. The animals didn't bark or jump. They watched her, their posture alert and focused. As she dumped the food into their trough, she gave a low whistle. The dogs didn't rush to eat. Instead, they fanned out, each one moving to a specific point along the tree line, settling into a watchful crouch. They weren't pets. They were sentinels, positioned at precise angles of approach, their attention fixed on the perimeter. The soldiers noted the behavior as odd but dismissed it as trained guard animals. They didn't see the placement as part of a larger defensive grid. Next, she moved to the eastern fence line, her hand trailing along the top wire. To the aliens, it was a simple check for breaks or weakness. In reality, her fingers brushed against a series of insulated contact points hidden within the barbs. She was testing the electrical current running through the seemingly innocent wire, ensuring the charge was live, and the breakaway sections were primed. A section of that fence could deliver a stunning jolt or drop flat to create a sudden, unexpected lane of fire. The veterans saw rusted wire and old posts. They missed the potential energy coiled within the lazy morning quiet. Her final chore took her to the livestock trough near the center of the yard. She worked the hand pump, sending water gushing into the large metal container. The sound was ordinary, the action mundane. But the water wasn't just for drinking. It filled a hydraulic reservoir buried deep beneath the packed earth. The weight of the water primed a pressure-sensitive plate under the dust, a trap that could buckle the ground under a man's weight or launch a cloud of corrosive chemical mist. She was watering her defenses, not her animals. The landscape itself had been weaponized through years of deliberate, patient preparation. Every rock, every ditch, every outbuilding had a dual purpose. The soldiers walked through the yard, their boots crunching on the gravel. They discussed sight lines and cover, their training providing a narrow professional assessment of the terrain. They walked through a battlefield disguised as retirement property and called it a vulnerable homestead. Their elite training had covered urban combat, jungle warfare, and starship boarding actions. It had never prepared them for warfare against an opponent who didn't just occupy the battlefield, but had personally designed and built every inch of it over decades. They were specialists in using terrain. She was a master of creating it. They were reading a map. She had drawn it. Their confidence was the last asset they had, and it was based on a complete misreading of the environment. The ranch was awake. It was waiting, and they were standing in the center of the kill zone, utterly unaware that the morning's tranquility was the calm before a storm they had triggered themselves. Vance's ranch wasn't remote by accident. Its isolation was a strategic choice. The alien soldiers saw a woman cut off from support, a target hidden far from help. They assumed no signals could get in or out of this mountain valley. They were wrong. The location wasn't a weakness. It was the core of her defense. The property sat in a unique geological bowl, a natural amphitheater carved by glaciers millennia ago. The curved rock faces that surrounded the ranch didn't block transmissions. They caught them and threw them back, amplifying a whisper into a shout that could travel for miles. Her signal didn't fight the terrain. It used it. Old mining tunnels from a forgotten century ran through the mountains like veins. Vance had mapped everyone. They weren't just holes in the rock. They were waveguides. A low-power transmission from her basement would funnel into those narrow stone passages, focused and intensified, traveling for kilometers without losing coherence until it shot up a vertical ventilation shaft and into the clear air above the peaks. It was a natural antenna system, built by geology and perfected by patience. Their advanced scanners swept the area and found nothing. They were looking for the sharp, clean signature of military-grade transmitters. They didn't account for a signal that used the mountain's own ambient radiation as camouflage, broadcasting on frequencies that sounded like background static or mineral deposits shifting deep underground. Every seasonal change became part of her network. Winter's deep snowpack dampened certain frequencies but reflected others, creating a seasonal communications map she had memorized. Summer's heat haze could bend a signal, skipping it off the ionosphere in unexpected ways. She knew which rainstorms would absorb long-range transmissions and which thunderheads would bounce them back to Earth. Her comm system was a living thing, integrated with the weather and the land itself. It was invisible to anyone who didn't understand the environment as a whole system. Their technology was built in a lab. Hers was grown from the dirt. This geographical understanding provided the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. Their transport didn't break down. Her terrain disabled it. The shallow, iron-rich creek bed they parked next to created a localized magnetic anomaly that scrambled their landing systems at a precise moment. The specific mineral composition of the soil where their engine exhaust touched down created a brief corrosive feedback loop. It looked like a coincidence. It was a trap. They thought they had tracked a lonely signal to a vulnerable source. In reality, she had broadcast a carefully crafted lure on a carrier wave that used the mountain as an amplifier. They followed a breadcrumb trail she laid directly into the heart of her prepared killing zone. Their mission was never a surprise attack. It was an invitation to a demonstration. They didn't find her. She allowed them to arrive. Their arrogance was the final component in a weapon system made of rock and radio waves, and she had just finished priming it. The first move wasn't a shot. It was the air in the room changing. The pressure dropped. The alien leader's hand twitched toward his sidearm. A simple motion practiced 10,000 times. He believed he controlled the timeline. He thought the shift from observation to action was his decision to make. His fingers never reached the weapon. Vance's voice cut through the tension, calm and low, the way you might speak to a spooked animal. That calm stopped him cold. His hand froze an inch from the grip. The command to fire died in his throat. All four of his teammates mirrored his arrested motion. Their bodies caught between two conflicting signals. Their training said attack. But the woman's absolute stillness said wait. Her face held a faint smile, a polite curve of the lips that didn't touch her eyes. Those eyes had seen this exact moment play out for decades. They'd watched soldiers just like this one make the same calculation, the same fatal error in judgment. They held no anger, no fear, just the flat, patient look of a predator that has already won the fight before it begins. She didn't move from her spot by the kitchen counter. She simply watched the leader's aborted motion as if noting a minor breach of etiquette. Her lack of reaction was more threatening than any battle cry. She spoke then, her tone conversational, almost weary. She said they sent children to finish what high command couldn't. The words weren't an insult, not in the way they understood it. There was no heat behind them. It was a simple, factual assessment of their capability, delivered with the dispassionate tone of a logistics report. She wasn't questioning their courage. She was evaluating their operational readiness against the known threat profile. Hers. The statement landed with the weight of undeniable truth. It bypassed their pride and struck directly at their training. They were elite. They were the best their empire had to offer. And she was telling them they were insufficient for the task. In that suspended second, their entire understanding of the mission inverted. They realized she knew. She knew their exact mission parameters. The elimination of a high-value target designated Gamma 7. She knew their failure conditions, the acceptable collateral damage, the self-destruct protocols for their gear, the window for extraction. She knew their call signs, their weapon loadouts, the name of the admiral who signed their orders, their tactical advantage, the element of surprise they thought they held evaporated. It had never existed. They were not hunters executing a plan. They were assets moving through a scenario she had written for them. The intelligence gap wasn't a minor oversight. It was a canyon, and they were standing on the wrong side of it. The combat began in that silence. No weapons discharged. No one moved. The first move was hers, and she made it by doing nothing but speaking a simple truth. She established total psychological dominance without raising her voice or her hands. The fight was over before it started. The only thing left was the messy business of confirming the outcome. Their confidence shattered. Their initiative vanished. They were no longer soldiers on a mission. They were specimens under observation, and the experiment had just entered its final phase. The air remained heavy, charged with the unspoken understanding that they had already lost. The only variable left was how many of them would be walking away from her porch. The ranch shed its peaceful skin and became a labyrinth of repurposed violence. The alien soldiers expected a firefight. They braced for military-grade plasma rifles and standardized Imperial combat doctrine. They got a hay baler. The machine sat silent and rusted until their leader took cover behind it. Then it whined to life, not compressing hay but launching coiled strands of razor-sharp barbed wire with the force of a shotgun blast. The wire wrapped around armor, snagged on weapons, turned a defensive position into a death trap. A soldier backed toward a water trough for cover. His boot touched the damp earth beside it. The water's surface crackled, a blue-white arc of electricity leaping from the metal rim to his suit. The harmless livestock tank became an electrified barrier. Their training had no protocol for this. Farming drones descended from the barn's hayloft. They weren't spraying crops. Their undersides held modified welding torches, sputtering to life with actinic blue flames. They didn't target the soldiers directly. They went for the environment. They severed rope lines holding up feed sacks, dropping heavy weights. They sliced through the support chain on a hoist, sending a metal bucket swinging like a wrecking ball. A livestock gate meant to corral cattle slammed shut on its own, powered by a hidden hydraulic piston. It didn't just close. It crushed. Their advanced optic scopes and motion trackers were useless. The threats weren't human-shaped heat signatures. They were the landscape itself turning against them. Vance moved through the chaos she had designed. She didn't run. She walked with a toolbox in one hand, her movements economical and precise. She sidestepped a panicked burst of plasma fire that shattered a water pipe, the spray immediately grounding out another soldier's electrical systems. She wasn't fighting to kill them quickly. She was demonstrating a point. Her attacks used the resources they had dismissed as junk. A length of chain became a whip. A bag of quicklime mixed with the water from the broken pipe became a burning cloud. A simple pry bar, leveraged against a specific point on a tractor's axle, released a tensioned spring that fired a rail spike like a crossbow bolt. She fought with physics and chemistry, with leverage and timing. Their technology was a liability. Their plasma rifles were too powerful for close quarters, their shots punching through walls and igniting fires that worked to her advantage, obscuring sightlines and creating new hazards. Their armor was designed for energy weapons, not for barbed wire or falling tools. They spent their ammunition on shadows and traps. They fired at movement behind windows only to realize it was a blanket stirred by a fan. They emptied a charge pack into the drone that was welding a door shut, only for 2 more to drop from the rafters. They were expending their most valuable resource, their limited energy cells, against a foe who was spending calculation. Her currency was ingenuity and her account was bottomless. Every move was planned years in advance, every countermeasure rehearsed in her mind 1,000 times. The elite soldiers, the best their empire could produce, were systematically dismantled, not by a superior army, but by a retired woman with a lifetime of tactical innovation and a well-stocked shed. They fell to pulleys and levers, to chemical reactions and redirected energy. Their defeat was not just a physical event. It was a humiliation of their entire philosophy of war. They lost to a toolbox. The young soldier expected death. He had seen it find his comrades with swift, brutal efficiency. He knelt in the dust, his armor scuffed, his weapon gone. He stared at the body of his team leader a few feet away and waited for the shot. It didn't come. Vance stood over him, her hands clean, her breathing even. She didn't point a weapon. She offered a choice. Not life or death. A mission. She told him he would live. His survival was not an act of mercy. It was a logistical requirement. He would serve a strategic purpose far beyond the value of his death. He was a vessel now. His only function was to carry a message. The terms were simple. He would return to his command structure. He would deliver a full and detailed report. He would tell them exactly what happened on this remote ranch. He would describe how 5 elite Imperial soldiers, armed with the best technology his civilization could produce, were systematically dismantled by one retired human woman. He would detail the traps made from farming equipment. He would explain the defeat of veterans by water troughs and hay balers. He would recount the calm, dispassionate voice that dissected their mission before it began. His testimony would be his weapon. His memory would be the delivery system. Orbital supremacy didn't erode. It shattered. It shifted in minutes. The Imperial command ship, a behemoth of polished metal and arrogance, found itself isolated, its escorts pinned down or destroyed by hit-and-run attacks from ships a fraction of their size. Its shields flared under a concentrated barrage of kinetic impactors, simple tungsten rods fired from railguns hidden on those repurposed asteroids. There was no grand, fiery explosion. The giant ship simply went dark, its systems overwhelmed, its command crew neutralized. The balance of power in the sector, a balance the Empire had spent a generation cementing, tilted. It didn't tilt because of a massive fleet engagement or a new superweapon. It tilted because 5 soldiers knocked on a retired woman's door and underestimated her. The most significant strategic shift in a generation began not in a war room, but on a wooden porch, with a simple offer of coffee and a calculated assessment of the cold. Vance's warning proved prophetic. The alien empire believed humanity stood on the verge of final submission. Their intelligence reports showed a broken people, a species on its knees after the bloodletting at Cygnus Gate. They were wrong. Her actions on that remote ranch triggered a cascade they never anticipated. The signal she sent did more than wake sleeping ships. It traveled through channels they never monitored, along paths they never thought to guard. It moved through civilian data nets and old military frequencies, through ham radio operators and buried fiber optics. It wasn't a call to arms. It was a data packet. It contained the same thing she sent at Cygnus Gate. Confirmed proof of Imperial arrogance, evidence of their fatal miscalculation. It was another invitation. Factory worlds that had been building Imperial walkers for years suddenly had power failures. The shutdowns were precise, targeted. Critical assembly lines went dark. Sabotage teams didn't use explosives. They used wrenches and code, creating delays that would take weeks to repair. Mining colonies on distant asteroids accidentally vented entire loads of refined minerals into space, the precious resources glittering like useless dust against the black. Civilian freighters, hundreds of them, suddenly altered course. Their holds were not empty. They carried volunteers and whatever weapons they could scrap together. They weren't soldiers. They were engineers, mechanics, cooks. They were answering the invitation. The Imperial response was slow and confused. Their arrogance had made them blind. They had maps of military bases and troop movements. They had no maps for this. They couldn't comprehend a war fought by factory workers and freighter captains. Their suppression fleets found empty shipyards and silent mines. The rebellion wasn't a front line. It was a virus in their bloodstream. Human resilience outpaced Imperial doctrine at every turn. Their centralized command structure was a liability against a decentralized organic resistance. Every attempt to crush one uprising created two more. The war they thought was nearly won became suddenly, catastrophically unwinnable. Their miscalculation was fundamental. They had spent decades studying human weapons and tactics. They never studied human spirit. They awakened not just a few remaining soldiers, but an entire species' ingrained will to resist. They prodded a beehive thinking it was abandoned, and found it full and waiting. The flaw was in their initial assessment. They believed victory was a matter of destroying military assets. They failed to understand that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't its army. It was its individual choice to fight back. That choice could not be bombed into submission. It could only be provoked. And they had provided the ultimate provocation. Underestimating that capacity for resistance proved to be their fatal flaw. It was an error in their core programming, a blind spot in their strategic logic. They saw a retired woman and assumed vulnerability. They saw a quiet ranch and saw weakness. They saw a species licking its wounds and saw defeat. They were wrong on every count. The 5 soldiers who knocked on her door seeking shelter didn't just find a formidable opponent. They found the catalyst. Their arrogant assumption that she was an easy target was the spark. That spark landed in the tinder of 1 billion quiet resentments and 1,000 prepared plans. It lit a fire that raced across star systems, fueled by a simple, universal truth they had never factored into their equations. Humanity, when left with a choice, will almost always choose to fight. The galactic inferno began not with a declaration of war but with a knock on a door.